they could work. And universal credit makes it possible to do that.
Okay.
So we have the work allowance.
Welcome everyone to this highly topical meeting on universal credit. I'm Paul Goodman, the editor of Conservative Home. I'm delighted to see there's so much interest with these cameras in the back, and delighted again to be doing an event with our friends at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So our speakers are going to talk about how universal credit can deliver support for households. And no one knows more about universal credit than the first speaker, because, as it were, he invented it. Ian Duncan Smith, former Work and Pensions Secretary, the driving force behind the Centre for Social Justice, really fought to get universal credit up and running in the first place. And he will speak to us now. Welcome, Ian.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. I thought you were going to give me at least an hour to wait. Always good to be thrown in at the deep end. First of all, thanks very much indeed. It should be topical anyway, but quite often it's not. We talk about other things. I think it's important, really, because, first of all, universal credit wasn't the back of an envelope idea. It was centred on what the problem was. So when I first got into the Department for Work and Pensions, I recognised we needed to explain to people what the problem was that we were wanting to solve. It's a good lesson for it's a good lesson for governments to learn, is that set up the problem first and then find the solution. Sometimes governments tend to want to find the solution first and then arrive at the problem, but it's better with the problem first. I recommend that to everybody that goes into government. And the problem was that the existing benefit system trapped people too often into choices that people in work wouldn't have to make. So one of the areas that I debated with them was that the whole idea about withdrawal rates was set originally back in the day when almost all work was full-time work. So you either were unemployed or you were in full-time work. Modern society has changed a lot, so there is a lot of part-time work out there. Some of it suits a greater number of people coming in with caring responsibilities. Obviously, hugely a lot of women coming into the workforce, much more than they were back at in the days of the 50s, etc., mean that they often have caring responsibilities, and so they will want flexible systems that allow them to part-time work. Sometimes that work goes up, sometimes the hours go down. All of these things were not being met by benefit systems that were absolute. The second thing was that when you looked at tax credits, whilst in principle a reasonable idea, actually ended up creating greater problems because, of course, the systems around them hadn't changed. So what they ended up doing was tax credits, you would get an assumption about your earnings, your hours you were working during the course of a year. At the end of the year, if those hours didn't match what they had assumed and ended up being more, then you would be presented with a bill to pay back to the exchequer for the monies that they overpaid you. Now, of course, if you are someone living on fairly marginal income, hugely supported or having to be supported by a benefit system, the chances of you having any savings at the end of the year are absolutely zero. So my surgery was almost always full, and when you were there, you must have had the same problem. Towards the end of the year, when the bills came through, they would come and see me because they couldn't pay them. £5,000, £6,000, £7,000 maybe was overpaid, and they would go into debt. And of course, we know the problem with debt. Debt is probably one of the single biggest causes of family breakdown. So the problem that comes, it's not just the money, it's what it does to your lifestyle. And if you have family breakdown, and there are real problems and divisions, you can end up in areas where your kids then suffer, and they fail at school because they're not going to be properly supported, no one's been prepared for it. You then end up often with kids in addiction. So there's a whole roll-on, which is what the Centre for Social Justice looks at, of what happens if your system doesn't recognise the nature of what's happening around you. So the thing about universal credit we had to do was we wanted to make sure that we understood early on what your income was. So it now does a monthly assessment in arrears of what income it was that you were earning that month. So the ups and downs of your income can be met a month later by the changes to universal credit, so that by the end of the year you shouldn't be receiving bills for something overpaid because the system had actually coped with your variable hours that you worked. So that was the first thing, to try and set a system up that actually understood and dealt with the nature of how part-time work works for those who do it, either by choice or because they're on their way into full-time work. And they're not both the same. Some people will always be on part-time work because they have significant caring responsibilities, so that flexibility is a permanence for them. But for somebody who's been out of work, wants to be in work, takes a job of 20 hours a week, but they're really wanting to be in full-time work, well, you also need to match that aspirations. And so you have the taper that works for that, which is a taper that is the same for everybody. And I was very pleased that the previous Chancellor early on dropped the taper to where we had originally wanted it to be, because the taper, you can argue, and this is the point about universal credit, in a way it mirrors what people in employment do. So the taper is in a way a tax system. So that tax system should be reasonably progressive, and it's terrible that the people in the poorest incomes then end up paying the highest marginal tax. And that was my other argument about benefit system. The withdrawal rates were so high that in a way nobody in work would put up with that tax rate, and it was much higher. So having it up in the 60s, 65% was ludicrous, and we couldn't quite win that battle, but I was pleased that we persuaded the Chancellor to lower it down to 55. That's a good start. I think it should come lower in due course, and I think that would be, because nothing better incentive than if we think for people, as we've been arguing this week, that lower taxes produce growth, then why would it be different for people on benefits? If you have a lower withdrawal rate, then they're more likely to be proactive, more likely to get on, more likely to be able to be productive, etc. They're not different from those in work, and so we should stop thinking about people who are unemployed as different in the sense that their aspirations are any different. It's just their conditions sometimes and their lives mean that they're unable to quite perform in the way that others are. So the universal credit system was set up to deal with those problems. And finally, of course, it has something which people don't fully understand, is not just the taper rate, but work allowances. Now, work allowances are critical and often forgotten in this, because unlike other benefit systems, what we now can do with universal credit is we can look at what your particular condition is. You know, are you single? Do you have a family? Do you have disabilities? And you can set that moment when the taper begins further out for people with more significant problems. That's a really critical area, by the way, that often gets forgotten. So the withdrawal rate is important, but where it begins is even more important, so that you keep more of your income before you start to lose it. That helps those who are in greater difficulty, so it tends to lean towards those in greater difficulty, which allows it to support people who have sickness conditions and perennial issues and problems. And it was designed like that for that reason. And interestingly, it was, we had it, I can't remember what it was originally described as, but we changed it to work allowances because it's like a tax allowance. And we wanted it to sound and look just like the tax system, so people didn't get confused. When they were unemployed, system by and large treated them fairly and got them through into work where they could do. So the allowance is what it is. It's like a tax allowance. It gives you greater scope. You have family tax allowances, and this is exactly what it is. So to that degree, universal credit, I'm sorry, I'll finish because I know you've got others to speak. But so that's what it was. Now, I have to think the more you invest in that system, the better life becomes for those at the bottom end of society who are unable to do these things, and the more progressive it is so that more people can enter into full-time work because they've been helped and assisted. And that has to be what we want to do. More than anything else, we need a benefit system that helps people who can get into work, and those who can rise past the benefit system into full-time work to be assisted to do so. And their job centre advisors, instead of just getting people into work, now can talk to people who are doing part-time work to help advise them, and that's the key to help them progress. The final bit I want to say about it, which has never been implemented, and I would recommend the government comes and talks to me about this. They might not talk to me, they can talk to somebody else, I don't mind, but come and talk to the Centre for Social Justice, is a thing called universal support. I would actually say, hands up, anybody here who's heard of universal support? Anyone at the Centre for Social Justice is not allowed to put their hands up. Anybody here heard of universal support? No, look at that. Universal support was designed by myself and others to go alongside universal credit. Why? Universal credit isn't just a back-to-work benefit system. Universal credit is a fantastic way of identifying, and for those who don't know, it, by the way, does household income. So we know when you're on universal credit what the earnings of your whole household are for the first time ever. So we know which households are really in problems and which ones aren't, because you may be the only person out of work, whereas the rest may be in work. So we understand what your income is. So how do we use that information? That information was designed to be used so that we could target those families with the greatest perennial problems, that therefore keep them away from the world of work, other than if they're in sickness benefit or they have disability allowances, those who we could. So drug addiction, alcohol abuse, issues, say, around debt. Debt's one of the biggest reasons why people go into work and come straight out again, because they end up having to pick up their debt and pay it off much quicker. Dealing with those is important. So what you can do with universal, you can identify those families and those individuals, then you move them over to another system called universal support, where you target support and help to change their lives and to improve and help them. Then they can move back into the system, and you're more likely to get them into work. So I would love to see that bit of universal credit rolled out alongside universal credit, universal support, and that would help change lives. And at the end of the day, what was this all about? It's not about pounds and pence or whatever. It's about people. It's about people's lives that we design universal credit. We need to change people, help them change their lives so they can be more productive for themselves and ultimately more productive. And we want growth in the economy. Well, we have a lot of people sitting on benefits at the moment who would love, I think, to get back into work, want to get them back into work. That's one of your ways of creating growth in society, is to make people, help them be more productive. And the other final bit I would say about, we did a lot of changes on the disability side to try, disability confident, was to try and say to companies, you should be looking to employ people with disabilities. They're desperate to be in work. It's just that when you employ them, they work harder, they stay longer, and they're more productive than people who don't have disabilities generally as a rule, and so why not employ them? So that's part of what universal credit is all about, make life easier for people to enter work and stay in work. And I think we should invest in it, not invest. How's that for a double negative? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next, we're going to hear from Katie Schmuck, who's the Principal Policy Advisor at the JRF.
Thanks very much. And I mean, I would agree with so much of what Ian has said there about the positives of universal credit. It's been a crucial innovation in our social security system. It's dynamic, it's responsive, it's digital. It's been absolutely vital in supporting people to get through the pandemic and also getting help quickly to people during this cost of living emergency that we find ourselves in now. And JRF has always regarded universal credit as having huge potential as a poverty-fighting tool. You know, it makes it easier to claim everything that you're entitled to. It smooths that journey into work. And those are really crucial characteristics. And I mean, it's true to say that we have not always agreed with every single policy choice that has been made about universal credit. But, you know, policies come and go and they can change. And the important thing, I think, is the structure. And actually, most of us on this panel, I think, at different times have argued that some of the cuts to universal credit have actually gone too far. And I think there is a growing problem here that universal credit is associated with poverty and deprivation in the minds of the public, increasingly so. And it's maybe not surprising when you consider that our basic rate of benefits is now its lowest in real terms for 40 years. It barely clears the destitution line if you're a single adult without children. And if you're under 25, it doesn't even clear that line. And those rates are often brought lower still by some features of the system. For example, the way in which debt deductions are taken out of social security payments, the benefit cap, the rates being lower if you're under 25. There are various ways in which those already low rates of universal credit can be brought lower still. And I think it's really important to remember that because of the way in which universal credit is designed, a low basic benefit isn't just a problem for people who are out of work. It is also a problem for those who are in work, because that basic rate of benefits is the foundation upon which the rest of the system is built. So a low basic rate of benefits brings down incomes for people who are out of work, but it brings down incomes for low-paid working families as well. And I think, you know, what we've seen happen to social security over many years, we can see the impact of this all around us. Even before the pandemic, destitution was rising, poverty was deepening, both for people who are in and out of work. We see food bank use rising very sharply. And that picture is far worse now in the cost of living crisis that we find ourselves in, where it is the cost of essentials like energy and food that are going up the fastest. And that damages the fabric of our society. It holds people back to be facing such high levels of hardship. It is difficult to mentally engage with the idea of retraining, of moving into work, of going to find a different job, if everything in your mind is taken up with thinking about how you're going to cover the basics. It's damaging to people's health, and it is damaging to their prospects. And what's more, the public are really concerned about this. They are concerned at what they see around them, happening in the communities around them. And I think there is a real risk that this situation deteriorates further if the government doesn't stick with the pledge that was previously made to uprate benefits in the usual way. That reassurance has not been offered, particularly in interviews in the last few days, and we are really concerned that that would be a deeply harmful move that would actually be really unpopular as well. So to move to the more positive in terms of what we think needs to happen, at JRF we've been recently doing a lot of deliberative focus groups with swing voters. We've been doing quite a lot of polling as well. And that confirms that over 80% of people agree that going without the essentials is a big problem in our country, and it is one that more can and should be done about. And actually, 3/4 of Conservative voters agree with that as well. And the level of agreement among swing voters is really high at 88%. So these are issues that are highly salient right now. And I think the public's views on social security have been changing over time. They've been softening as they have seen the impact of some of the changes to our social security system playing out in real life. So what we found from the work that we've been doing is that the idea that social security should be there for all of us at times when we need it, when we fall on hard times, that really resonates with people. And they are shocked to discover that the basic rate of social security is £335 per month if you're a single person. That's £335 per month to cover your food, your bills, your travel, your toiletries, your clothes. It doesn't cover your housing costs. They would be covered separately. However, that payment doesn't always cover the cost of renting in full, so often people have to cross-subsidise that a bit as well. So people are shocked to discover that. And they're also shocked to discover that that amount has no basis whatsoever in a calculation of what the basics are that you should be able to afford in life or how much those things cost. That needs to change. So at JRF, along with our friends at the Trussell Trust, we have been exploring how you could enshrine within universal credit the idea that no one should go without the essentials. And that means creating, we think, a minimum benefit rate for an adult that is set in accordance with what it costs to meet their basic needs, and below which their income cannot fall. Our working name for this is an essentials guarantee within universal credit, and we think it is something that would help to shore up the system from the bottom. Because at the end of the day, anyone who finds themselves needing to rely on social security, whether that's because they're unable to work, they're unemployed and looking for a job, they're in work but they're low paid, if you find yourself in that situation in a wealthy country like ours, you should always, at the very least, be assured that you can afford to cover the essentials.
Katie. Thanks very much. And next we're going to have Charlotte Pickles, who's Director of Reform, who's worked with Ian both in the Department of Work and Pensions and at the Centre for Social Justice, and is presently on the Social Security Advisory Committee, I think, which keeps a beady eye on what government is doing in this area. So, Charlotte,
Though I should say I'm definitely not speaking on behalf of SAC, otherwise I will get in trouble for that. So I'm definitely speaking in a personal capacity or for reform. As was just said, I had the privilege of being part of Ian's team during that early part of the coalition when universal credit was implemented. And I think people have just got so used to it being in existence now that we sort of take for granted just how revolutionary it actually was when it was implemented. And, you know, Katie mentioned there, had we gone through the pandemic, not having universal credit in place, there would have been tragedy. There would have been a disaster because the response couldn't have been there had it not been for universal credit that Ian, with a little bit of help from several others, including actually the CSJ, who obviously worked on it before, had put that in place. So I think it is worth just remembering that. I'm going to try and be very brief because I'm sure everybody's going to have lots and lots of questions in the audience, and I'm sure we'll want to particularly pick up on a few things that are very pertinent at the moment with Ian. But I did want to just mention probably 4 different things in the question, which was how do you create a sustainable model going forward? And I think the first thing has to be to pick up on this idea of being able to cover the basics or cover the essentials. And I do really believe that the sign of a compassionate society is that there is a robust safety net in place. And I don't believe you can say that at the moment. And I think one of the tragedies of the last decade has been that the brilliant work that Ian did in bringing in universal credit was undermined in certain areas by unnecessary cuts. And I don't think you can say you're a compassionate society if actually you make the poorest people poorer by the decisions that you take. And that is what has happened with freezing the benefit uprating and then not uprating at the level it should have been. And, you know, I'm sure Ian won't mind me saying, in fact, I'm sure he's said it many times before, but we fought tooth and nail against having a benefit freeze. And as Ian's pointed out, it's brilliant to see that there has been since changes to the taper rate and to the work allowances. They should have been in place at the start, and that was what universal credit certainly was designed to do. But I think the most important thing was getting universal credit through and implemented. And now we need to work out how we really bring it back to what that initial vision that Ian had was. So you can probably guess what my response to should we uprate benefits by inflation is without me stating it. So I think that kind of the idea of a compassionate society and really understanding the impact on the poorest at the most basic fundamental level is my first point. The second, though, is that I think we do get very hung up on the standard allowance. And I think the standard allowance is too low. You know, I've been very clear already. But actually, there's an awful lot more money that goes into the benefit system than just that standard allowance. And I think we too often focus solely on that number, and we don't spend enough time thinking about the myriad of top-ups there are for other groups, so the extra cost benefits. And I think it would be more helpful in these discussions, given the sheer size of the benefit bill, to actually think about where you're best placed investing more, and where you might want to think about doing things slightly differently. So whether that's on, you know, the extra cost disability top-ups or children or housing, and there's a whole range of them. And I think we probably need to think of the system in the round and the way that those different parts of it interact to provide support, because very few people are receiving that £300 odd that Katie mentioned. Most people will be receiving an awful lot more than that. And again, that's not to say it's enough, but I think it's slightly misleading if we only focus on that particular number. Linked to that, my third point that I wanted to mention, thinking about that sustainable model, you know, one of the reasons I was so passionate about working for Ian on this agenda was this real focus on ensuring we had a system that both went with the grain of human nature and actually supported people to achieve their potential in life. And that is what making work pay was supposed to do. That's what having a system that allowed you to be in and out of work was supposed to do. That's what, Ian mentioned it, universal support services were supposed to do, to help people to overcome complex barriers, to be able to reach their potential by moving into work and hopefully moving up into work. And my gosh, the ultimate aim, moving them off benefits, because actually we don't want people on benefits, right? We want people to be in well-paid work so that they're not dependent on top-ups. And so I think, again, thinking about the wraparound services, I won't go further into universal support, I'm delighted that Ian mentioned it, but also the employment support. And we don't do enough to help those furthest from the labour market, to really provide them with the support and assistance that would help them to overcome those barriers, whether that is about drug addiction that Ian mentioned, or actually the biggest area and the area that we just fail the group over and over, which is disabled people. And it is shocking the gap in employment rates for disabled people and non-disabled people. And yet we still don't spend anything close to what it would take to really move the needle in terms of employment support for that group of people. And going back to the point about growth, you get people into work, they pay taxes, you pay less in benefits. It's a win-win, right? Businesses get more talent in their workplaces. So I think we need to think about that. And just finally, I wanted to just touch on the question of legitimacy, because I think that sometimes, again, we have conversations about the benefit system which are quite one-sided. And Katie's right to say there is a more, if you look at the data in the polling, in fact, the British Social Attitudes Survey came out just a couple of weeks ago, which is data from 2021, but the most recent data on this, and they've been tracking views of the public around welfare for years and years. And, you know, we are in a period where there is a slightly more what they call, I think, pro-welfare view. But it's not a majority of people. And there still is, I think, some serious questions about how we make sure that the public and those paying for the system really do believe it's legitimate and it's got the right incentives, it's driving the right outcomes. And I think that also leads us to questions about kind of where we spend the money and whether we really think the best way is topping up really expensive rental housing, for example, private rental housing, rather than actually getting on and building more social housing, which would be a hell of a lot cheaper and would reduce the benefit bill. But I think it is important, you know, just as one stat, in the British Social Attitudes Survey, where they asked if welfare benefits weren't so generous, people would stand on their own 2 feet, and they asked, do you agree or disagree with that question? It's pretty, well, it's about 40% think that, yes, people could just stand on their own 2 feet, and 40% who think they couldn't. So it's not quite as clear as saying that everybody, the public, is bought into this. I think we need to make the argument for why having that solid, robust safety net and a system that drives with the grain of reaching people's potential is actually a good thing for society and the economy, because that's part of what underpins people's belief in a legitimate system. And I think we have to have that as part of the broader conversation around a sustainable welfare model going forward.
Charlotte, thank you very much. Ian, I'll just get the up-rating question out of the way now, because if I don't ask it, someone else almost certainly will.
Who do you want to ask?
Kate has said what she thinks. Kate has said what she thinks about the up-rating, right? Charlotte said what she thinks. What do you think?
Well, let me put this into context, and then I can give you my absolute position on it. The context of this is, I don't quite understand why we're having this discussion at this point. Bear in mind that uprating is done in arrears anyway, so you're reflecting where they've already been, in a sense. So a lot of people don't understand that. They think we're going to uprate exactly at that particular point. So you're already going to uprate at a lower level than inflation is probably likely to be at the time you uprate it. So first and foremost, it's a peculiar debate to be having, I think. The second point about it, really importantly, is that if you do want growth, the group that is most likely to spend the money that you give to them is the group that we're talking about right now, because their everyday is basically about their essentials. And so, in essence, that money will go straight back into the economy quicker than if you give somebody on, I don't know, 60, 70, 80,000 pounds a year, which we are going to do anyway under the cost of living saga. So there is a positive anyway at the moment if you want the economy to grow and for people to, for businesses, etc., is that the money you give to people through their benefit system will end up almost certainly back in the economy in double quick time. So there is a positive to this. The third bit of this equation is that, importantly right now, we need to get the balance right as we do this. And we did go through a period of frozen benefits. Now, I resigned government, some may have forgotten this, I haven't, but I resigned back in 2016 because I felt that the then government had lost the plot, really, on what the balance in society was about. And I just didn't think it was feasible any longer for us to go after what I call the working poor, because it was just, you're helping pensioners quite legitimately, but meanwhile you're bearing down on the people who are going to bear the cost anyway of that even harder. And I felt that the balance goes wrong. And you have to get a balance in society. So my sense about this right now, and I don't know whether there is a genuine debate taking place in government or not, or whether this is just a minister that has said something indicating that they're thinking about it. My view is very simply that the support that we give right now, we're going to give out on the cost of living, which is huge, a package we should be talking more about. But at the same time, it wouldn't make a huge amount of sense then to withdraw some of that by actually reducing or not uprating benefits at the same time. It doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, the rest of society gets support, but they end up getting less, and relatively, they're the ones that need it most. So my argument would be, I heard this morning, I was talking about seeing things in the round. I think we do need to see things in the round, and the reality is right now we want to get people through what is going to be perceived to be a difficult period during the winter on cost of living. Well, the benefit system is aimed at helping that anyway. In fact, I think the Centre for Social Justice produced, as I recall, well, actually I know that, I'm just pretending, produced a very good paper about how to target the benefit system. People talk about targeting the support on the cost of living. The truth is the only place you can really target is those on benefits, because you know now with universal credit what the household income is. So you know exactly who needs what extra money to get through. So I would say there's a case to look again at that to see whether or not there is a better way to target on top of that extra support to those who are going to be in the greatest circumstances. So, as I say, I don't know whether there's a legitimate debate taking place or not, but all I would say is just recall what universal credit and the benefit systems are about, supporting people who are unable to help themselves, but at the same time trying to help as many of those as possible back into the work system so they cease to become a recipient of benefits and then become taxpayers, thus being able to add to the economy, which is exactly what we're talking about, and grow it. So my point is, let's see this as a way of actually adding to the growth in the economy rather than seeing it as a drawdown on the economy, and get the balance right. And I think that's the key bit. I have argued for some time for the work allowances to be targeted much more, because they're the ones that are better at defining who is in greater need in the system, and that's a lever you can pull. We designed it like that, so that you can put money into particular groups as well, extra money, because they're the ones, maybe people with disabilities who need a bit more. You can target them. So it's not a sort of bland across the board, up or down. It's that some people could actually even get more because they need more, because they have more difficult circumstances. And universal credit looks at targeting that, and then you have all the sickness and disabilities. There's more reforms to be made. I'm not going to get into those here now. So my sense is right now this is, we shouldn't let this become an artificial debate. What we're here about is getting people through the winter and into the new year as we see inflation come back down. So the cost of living has to be dealt with at the bottom end of income, more so than in fact at the top end of income. And I think we need to focus on that. And getting those people through and keeping the economy growing is about making sure they have enough money to get by.
And were they not to be uprated in line with inflation, there would have to be a vote?
Almost certainly there would have to be a vote, because it's automatic, and therefore if you freeze it or change it, then that will be changing the system. I just don't. My personal view is I don't see what will be gained by it. I do see what will be gained by making sure that they have enough money through the winter, because, as I say, that money will flow back into the economy at a very time that we need the economy to be growing. That's one of the ways in which that economy will be supported from the bottom end. So my sense about this, in fairness and reasonableness, you know, I resigned back in 2016 over the idea that we got too far. I think to repeat that the mistake would be wrong at this stage, but I would like to see government think of it as a positive. It's a positive. You know, support the people who need it most has always been the reason why we're here. And I think this is the universal credit. We know that we can target better than ever before. Let's target. And I would remind the CSJ to get the paper out and reissue it in an hour from now so people can see it, and so that we can have a proper debate rather than this narrow debate that we have about up or down. This is more complex than that. The answer is people need the support.
After that hint to the CSJ, let's have a couple of questions. Yeah, hands are flying up everywhere. I'll go there, and then the gentleman there with the striped shirt. If you could give your names and all that jazz.
Thank you. Chris Pearson. Yeah, question to Sir Ian. Obviously, absolutely, you know, agree with everything you've said there on the reform and the brilliant work that Universal Credit has already done. Is the solution then to get the final bits of the system there that you they put you back in charge of the DWP and let you finish the job.
I cannot imagine you want that, do you?
That's the solution, isn't it? Because you understand it, you've led the charge on the design and the delivery in the first instance, you know, resigned on principle because of, I think it was the Osborne budget and the taper. You're clearly on top of the brief, so why don't we get you back in so you can deliver the final bits to make it work? Simple.
Is that your decision, Ian?
Of course, the missing bit of that question was you didn't ask me whether I wanted to go back into the Department of Work and Pensions. It's not that I need to go back into the Department of Work and Pensions. It's that we have the most radical system that took a lot to get it in against a lot of opposition, but once in, they all now claim, that's what they always say, you know, there's no end to what you can achieve as long as you're prepared to let somebody else take the credit for it. That's a rule of thumb, okay? And I'm very happy for others to take the credit for it, quite rightly too, because it's a government effort. But my point would be very simply that we have this system, and it has got the levers to help us get people out of poverty, so why don't we use it? And it targets better than anything else as well, because it's now got those elements that allow you to look at groups which you couldn't do in the previous system. So again, it's a brilliant way of helping people when there are problems. Cost of living crisis is a problem. Now you can really look at the household incomes and say these households really need extra support. These ones need support, but not as much as that lot. So you can now be much more specific about it rather than just saying it's a general value. In fact, that was the point that Charlie was saying early on. So my point is, we've got a system. Let's celebrate it. Let's use it. I would use it more rather than less in these circumstances and not create new systems. I'd be honest with you, I was a little bit against the whole furlough process during lockdown because I thought you could have used universal credit much more to be able to pick up the support because it's much more accurate than just creating new systems. It's there.
And
Ben Woolard from Together for Sheffield. Thanks so much for your tireless effort on universal credit. I spend a lot of my time helping people at risk of long-term unemployment into work, and I've seen firsthand the difference it's made. You've talked about resigning because the government went too far, and why is it, and I say this as a member of the Conservative Party, that a passion for the marginalised seems to be a fringe or irritating position to prevailing conservative thought? And you have obviously held this flame for a long time, and I'd just be really curious to hear, what is it about conservative ideology that seems to be pushing a desire for the marginalised to the edge?
Actually, I don't think that is the prevailing sense. I mean, in the Conservative Party in House of Commons, we have a social justice caucus. That social justice caucus has well over 100 MPs, regular attenders and members of it, who all agree about what you put into helping people change their lives means that they become more productive and participants in society generally has got to be positive. So that principle is already there, and I think you'll find as you go round, I'm not sure how many are here actually, but of those that are here and ask them the same question, they'll all say, this is an investment in success, not a support for failure, quite the opposite way around. And changing lives and helping people has got to be pretty much why we're here. Otherwise, we're just a bunch of accountants. Nothing against accountants, by the way, I'm sorry. But, we're dealing with esoteric figures, but we're not esoteric figures, these are people. And so that's what Member of Parliament are all about. And so I think instinctively that is in the DNA, and that's why I say I'm not certain quite how this argument erupted, but it's an argument I think we should just put to bed because it's a pointless argument to have because we're going to have to support people. We've already said that, and we're going to give them money, over £100 billion worth of money, with an enormous amount of money, and spreading it all the way up the chain. And I understand why that has to be done because it's once you're beyond the benefit system, it's almost impossible to target in the way that you can with the benefit system. But it would be strange to have an argument about spending that much money and then have a debate about, at the bottom end, the big group that really need the money, then, well, maybe we need to tighten up on them. No, you don't need to tighten up on them. What you need to do is figure out what you're doing with the 100 billion package for people, a lot of people who don't need the money. That's where the problem arises. I accept that, but my point is not down in the groups who are struggling anyway. You want that to be progressive, because that progression allows them to move into productive employment. And if you don't do it that way, then we end up with spending more money later on to sustain them in very unproductive lifestyles, and that's not what we want to do, is it?
I'd just bring Katie and Charlotte in here, because if you think about the new Truss government, and you say, which think tanks do you associate Liz Truss with? Which ones advise her or are close to her? People who watch us will say, well, it's the Institute for Economic Affairs and there's the CPS. But I don't think you'd say the CSJ was at the top of the queue, would you? Hang on.
I think you would certainly say the ones you've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think those ones definitely are influential on her thinking. But I mean, I think what's interesting is actually quite a few of those organisations have also been saying that, you need to support those on the lowest incomes. And that does mean uprating benefits in line with prices. And I absolutely do think that Liz Truss should be listening to the CSJ, because I think they do hone in on a lot of really important issues that are about what's happening at the bottom of society. And, I think that needs to be seen. Like, people, the public see it. They increasingly see it, and they're increasingly worried about it. So it is, for political reasons, really important that the government is listening to those voices that are talking about these issues, but actually it is also morally the right thing to do.
I think it's also, may I just very briefly add, I think one of the points about the uprating debate that sometimes gets missed is, or rather some people sort of talk about it in an odd way. So I think some of those saying we don't need to uprate at the level of inflation are sort of in some way implying because inflation will go down again and therefore, we don't need this one-off increase. But of course, this is about baking in a level of support. This isn't a one-off top-up. If you don't uprate by that level, people will be poorer by that amount forevermore unless you decide to have a higher level. So, it's not like saying, well, we're giving people on benefits a bonus and, actually we're going to give them less of a bonus. This is the level at which you're saying the minimum amount people should have is ad infinitum. And that's why it's important to set it in that context and not to further erode it.
Okay, we'll take one there and one there. Yeah.
Hi there, Margaret from Dimensions. I'm an actually three quick points. Number one, I'm glad you mentioned employment, because since pandemic, a lot more people have gone out of work, and now it's a lot harder struggle for people learning to find jobs. So, what question then? Two, I'd just like to say around, it still is a trap for people with learning disability to get a job, because then they have to make that choice of whether coming off benefits or going to that job, and then if that job doesn't work out, they have to go round in circles to try and get that benefit back. And three, around any other benefits, do you think it's fair for people whose physical disability or disability hasn't changed in 10 years, and then it's been reviewed? The guy can see in front of him all his notes, and then for that person to go through that painstaking of going through that review, even though they've got all the information in front of them.
Okay, and it was there.
Hi, I'm Evan John. I'm from Sense. We represent the 1.6 million people in the country with complex disabilities. In June, our research found that 50% of disabled households have been forced into debt as a result of the cost of living crisis. A lot of the time that will be due to energy costs they can't avoid, for example, running a feeding machine or ventilator. And given the fact that for full-time carers and disabled people who aren't able to work, tax rates make no difference, the taper rate will make no difference. How can the government support disabled people through a crisis that is disproportionately affecting them?
Okay, Katie.
Yeah, thanks. I think, two such important questions. I mean, I do think the question of the support that people with with learning disabilities or with other disabilities, or actually anyone who's been out of work for a long period of time, I think we still really underinvest in that at the moment. I think it feels a little bit like the government has slightly the wrong reading of the labour market at the moment, and actually it's those issues of people who've been out of work for a long time that need to be a really high priority. And, people want to work. The issue is the support, the confidence, the training, the skills to enable them to do that. And I think there are still lots of things about our system that get in the way of that, and we need to address that. And I think the point you make about constant reassessment for conditions that don't change is just, it's such an important message. We hear this all the time when we talk to people with experience of poverty, people who are disabled. And I think it feels like being made to jump through hoops to get what you are entitled to. And I think that's never a situation that we should be in. We should be making it easy for people to get the help that they are entitled to. Just coming on to your question, Evan, for me, the point that you make about there are some people who cannot work, and it may be that they will never be able to work, or it may be that there is just going to be a long period of time that they are unable to work because of a condition, because of caring responsibilities. Right now, in the face of a cost of living crisis, that is such an important group that we have to keep in our minds, because those are the people who can't just change their situation, go out and find a different job, increase their earnings. I think while I take the Charlotte's point about, there are the sort of £335 a month basic rate of benefits, there are lots of people who get various additions to that. If that amount itself is not enough, then people are having to cross-subsidise out of money that is intended for other things, out of money that is intended to be covering their additional costs because of their disability, money that is intended to be supporting their children. They're having to cross-subsidise within their family budget in order to cover their own needs as an adult, or they are simply going without themselves, and that is, of course, what we know most people end up doing, particularly when it comes to their children. So I think, that, because I think it's like the building block of the system is so important, so I would go back to that point about sort of an essentials guarantee within the system that ensures that people are able to afford the basics, because some people won't be able to work, and so it is really important, and then those add-ons should be covering those additional costs like disability or the costs of having children.
I think that the questions about disability are so important, and actually the likelihood of a disabled person or a household with a disabled person being in poverty is so much higher than a household that doesn't have a disabled person. And so it's such an unbelievably important part of the welfare conversation that we don't spend enough time on. Just very briefly, the point about the benefits trap, I think, is again, I remember leaving DWP, and the one thing I regretted not being able to spend time on was exactly this question. And actually, when I joined Reform the first time many years back, we did a trio of reports exactly on the kind of question of both the social security system, so the benefits part of it, and also the employment support part of it. But that fear of taking what seems like a big risk, losing that additional payment you get, because actually the standard allowance is, yes, the standard allowance, but if you're in the, what would have been equivalent of the support group, and I can never remember the long acronym in universal credit that it is, actually you're getting a lot more than that. So the risk of taking a chance and trying work and finding it doesn't pan out for whatever reason, maybe you need a few more goes, and then the fear of not getting back onto that level is huge. It's such a disincentive to being able to try work. And I think Ian's point about the work allowances is part of the answer, but actually really grasping with how you remove that trap is incredibly important. I think on the question of what's happened after the pandemic, and I think this slightly also picks up in bear with me a second, the question around people who are disabled who can't work. So we too often lump together people on benefits, right? And so there have actually even been, a few of very esteemed journalists recently who have talked about the 5 million or whatever on benefits. The majority of those people are actually economically inactive. Now, what does that mean? That means you are not required to look for work, never mind move into work. And probably more shockingly, you get barely any support. So if you right now are a disabled person dependent on benefits, you're pretty much ignored, right? And yet a large proportion of these people would like to work. A large proportion of people with the right support could work, and that's a really important point. And yet we just don't think about them enough. So I think there's a massive challenge between actually understanding the components of the groups that are dependent on benefits and really tailoring the support appropriately, removing those traps in the system, but really spending and investing in getting these groups into sustainable employment.
All right. The regret I have, okay, I'm going to be, the biggest regret I had about resigning was I was wanting to make a big change to the way that we looked at sickness and disability completely, because the time that I spent there, it became very apparent to me that the employment support allowance system doesn't work. It's both a trap and a problem, because it stops you going into work for a start. So if you're on ESA, you have a limited amount of hours you can work, and then the cut-off, that's it. If you take the work, that's it, you lose it. And that's the bit that you're really talking about here. And it did seem to me the more we looked at this, the more we should look at this, and this is, I think this would be the solution, but I would recommend the government does this. I looked at it again, and we had a big, careful look, and I said that I don't see why we don't now medicalise employment support allowance. In other words, it should be more about your condition than it is about the lump that you are in sickness benefit. So there are some people who have, we were talking about this earlier on, progressive conditions. I don't know, whatever the conditions are anyway, where actually, to begin with, they are quite mobile, quite capable, but progressively they're going to get worse. We know what their condition is going to be, where it's going to end up. That's a medical fact. So in a way, encouraging them through work, to be working, and then progressively less work because they are going to be less capable of work, would make more common sense. And taking away the hour limit barrier to work would make a huge difference. So somebody with Parkinson's, for example, is a very good example. Early on in the diagnosis, they probably can carry on normally, but they need a bit of support, and then the support grows and grows. With universal credit, the point was, with the sickness benefit, you have this taper process. So actually you can do this, so and the work allowances can expand to fit the medical condition as it gets worse, and the taper then cuts in for the hours they're doing. So limiting the hours is a problem, because it is a cut-off point and a disincentive. So that's within the system, and I would recommend that that's where we start to take this, so that those who can and want to work are encouraged to do so, and the system then is flexible enough to deal with it as that becomes less and less possible. And so those big, heavy choices that you have to make about all or nothing disappear, because the rest of universal credit isn't not about all or nothing, but it is under employment support allowance, which is, dysfunctional, frankly. But there is also disability living allowance, and we don't take that into condition. But with that, which is outside universal credit, that doesn't put a block on you. So it's a support package to give you a floor, because your conditions are such that you have more difficulty living your life, so it puts a floor underneath you. And then after that, it says, whatever you choose to do after that, are capable of doing, is over to you. It's remarkable that we have two benefits that end up going in exactly opposite directions. So my point is, the thing I agree with you, I know, is that more people who have disabilities want to be doing something, because we know that there is a health benefit to working, which the health department has finally accepted when I was there, that it's a health treatment to have people doing work that they can do, and it's to persuade private sector companies and public sector companies that actually it's a benefit to you to have people with disabilities. It helps your workforce, makes them more productive. It's socially very good, and at the same time it's good for those who had the disabilities to work. So we need to reform that, and I would say this is the place where the government needs to be now, is to find you've got a shortage of people working, and you've got a whole group of people who would really love to work, but the system works against them. What do? We shouldn't be talking about benefit reductions. We should talk about reforming the benefit system so that actually this last bit can allow more people to enter the workforce and thus be more productive, and that will help the economy much more than changing things like levels of benefit at this point, apart from rising them. So my point would be reform on this point is absolutely desperate. And I agree, supporting those in those conditions, because those are the households, and there's the whole point about universal credit. You can spot that household pretty quickly now, so you can target that, and we should be doing more about targeting, using that process of knowing which households have the worst outcomes.
There are two more there, and here at the front, yeah.
Thank you, Bob Hughes. As the whip that took the Maastricht Bill through the House of Commons, my praise for Ian used to be somewhat limited. But the getting universal credit through was the most amazing, impressive piece of statecraft, and really a great testament to what you did in government. Yeah, you never thought I'd say that.
I'm always ready.
I run a disability charity. We deliver social care to blind and deaf people. And huge swathes, 73% of blind graduates are unemployed and not able to get a job. The disability advisors keep changing, and frankly, they don't seem to have much training in disability, if any at all. Telling one of my blind employees who was doing a survey there, well, just go and sit on that bench over there. He said, I don't know where over there is, which wasn't a good start. Access to work is a complex, well-guarded secret, and employability, if I call it flabby, that's about the most polite I can be. And I agree with what you were just saying, Ian, that a concentration on that would really bring a lot of people off benefits into the workforce, doing great jobs, and of course, putting money into the economy.
Thank you. Lucy from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, abusing our position as sponsor. We know that the rates of social security aren't currently based on any kind of analysis of what people need. So my question is, should the rates of universal credit be set based on some assessment of what people need, and therefore always protect people from going without the essentials?
Sorry, I missed the last bit. I couldn't hear it. So.
Sorry, and therefore we protect people from going without the essentials. So should the system be based on?
Related to the question, the statement that you make earlier, I think. Yeah. Okay.
Ian, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that's the whole point about what your base position is. There is, Charlie's right about this, that when you look at it, it's more complex than just that, because, of course, most people will get that level, but then probably a number of them will get other elements of it, because bear in mind that within universal credit there's a disability element in it, as much as there is also disability benefit. So you can be getting one and not the other, or you could be getting both, as it were. So the reality is it's a little more complex than that, yes, but at the end of the day you want to put a floor under people so that they are getting enough to live their lives, but you want to take them somewhere else, which is the point I was making, where that allows them for themselves. And it's also good for people to progress, because that helps their well-being as well at the same time. So the idea that you just park somebody is the thing that I was always wanting to try and change, that you actually said they're there, but they're not there forever. We want to find a way in which they can navigate their lives so they can improve their lives, which is critical, because then they become more productive. It's good for them, it's good for the people around them, and it's good for the economy. So, yeah, I think there is how that level is set, of course, is always a matter for debate at the moment, but there's more reform to be done. That's my regret. Nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the crucial point, is it's about putting that floor in so that social security is not so low that people are going without, because we know that the impact of that on their health, on their well-being, is very damaging. And we know that it's sadly widespread at the moment in our country. I mean, we did a survey back in May looking at the cost of living impact on lower income households, and found that 7 million people were, 7 million households, which is, like, to try and put that into some context, that's like the equivalent of every single household in the whole of the north of England, had been going without at least one essential since the start of the year. And we were asking about things like food, heating, showers, toiletries. So, the real basics. And I think if we can shore up the system from the bottom up, it enables people to go on that journey then that you're describing, Ian. I think to be able to retrain, to be able to find work, to be able to move into work, to progress in work, and for those who aren't able to work, crucially, to have a greater level of stability and a sort of basis upon which their other add-ons, which are meant to cover other things, like the cost of their disability, then are just being used for those things that they are intended for, and aren't being used to cross-subsidise their basic living costs.
Can I make one small point? Something that needs to come into this debate, by the way, is an acknowledgement and understanding of how damaging the lockdown has been for a group of society. We did a thing on this the other day for children, for people on benefit. It's been an unmitigated disaster, frankly, because many of them have moved further away from the work, are still not back in those parameters, and most of them were living in conditions where, unlike much of the debates that took place on the media about people being able to sit in their gardens during nice summer days, these You know, if you're living on the 19th floor of a 25-story tower block with, you were lucky with a sort of 3-inch balcony outside, that's not the same, and then you were prosecuted if you stepped outside for a period. This was an area where we never want to return to ever again because it's done untold damage. That's the area we need to be looking at right now because we've got to change that. We've got so many kids that are now failed at school as a result, often not coming to school, gone missing. All these things are the fallouts from a series of decisions that were taken. We've got to pick those pieces up now. So now is the time to be talking about change and reform and getting those back in rather than limiting the benefit.
Sean.
So very briefly to pick up on Bob's point about the advice or the kind of work coaches in Job Centre Plus, and I'm probably going to be the only one on the panel who says this, but Job Centre Plus is an archaic model, and given that the majority of people currently sitting on benefits have complex needs, and a large part of those are disabled people, why on earth do we think a generalised workforce, you know, kind of top-down directed from the centre, is going to be specialist enough to be able to support the sort of people you're talking about? It's absurd to think we're going to, you know, we've been trying to use this model for decades, having no impact on supporting people. So, personally, I wouldn't have Job Centre Plus as a model. I would be using the sorts of specialist services that actually understand the nuances, the differences, the challenges, the barriers, but also the best way of supporting particular groups of people into work. And a lot of those will be small charities, not only, but a lot of them will be, that really also know their local economy and the local businesses and can work and build those relationships. So perhaps, as I say, I'd be the only one on the panel who would say that, but I think you know, if universal credit was the big reform on the social security side, and we've all acknowledged there are other things to do, then actually Job Centre Plus is the area we really haven't looked at, and I think we need to. Just very briefly on the question about essentials, I've been very clear. I think the standard allowance is too low, and I think benefits in general are too low. Yeah. But we do need to ask ourselves, how much money can we spend on benefits? So if, for example, then looking at a basket of goods would mean we double the benefit bill, what are we going to cut? Schools, health, social care, defence? Because there is only a certain amount of money, right? And, you know, we're here at Conservative Party Conference. We used to believe, as Conservatives, in fiscal responsibility. We didn't used to believe you could borrow and just borrow and borrow to be able to you know, and see those costs soar. So actually, yes, in an ideal world, we'd spend lots more money on all sorts of public services, but the money isn't there. And that's why we need the conversation. And I'm not drawing Ian into this part of my debate, but Ian's point about you have to reform services, right? You can't just keep saying, let's put more money into it. We've just had a conversation that says that the benefit system is trapping so many people. Well, wouldn't it be better to try and address those things, to think about Job Centre Plus, to think about removing the traps in the system, to actually invest in support services, to build social housing so we're not spending ludicrous amounts on often rogue landlords. So actually reforming it, because otherwise you can't spend more because the money isn't there.
We're beginning to thin out slightly, so we're probably down to our last two. So it's one there and one there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That picks up perfectly, Charlotte, on my question. So my name is Gina Cicerone. I'm the CEO of the Fair Education Alliance. And Ian, I was in your session the other day with a child of lockdown, Ogale, who's from a 16-story council flat in Battersea. And a shame we couldn't introduce you. And she said, look, I am a child of lockdown. My family's on benefits, on universal credit. And what I really want to know is that I'm the success story. I'm the one who made it to Oxford, going into my second year right now. But what needs to be done to think about skills for my brother, for my sister who haven't gone down this route, for my mum who's working her bum off to be able to support the family, and yet we're still trapped in this vicious cycle. And so I'm really curious to know about what reform does need to be done in terms of getting young people and adults the skills that they need to get them into work, as you're all saying. Thank you.
And that.
Hello, yeah, I'm Peter Tutton from Step Change Debt Charity, and firstly, thank you for an excellent debate. It's been fantastic. I guess we have, in debt advice, we have a concept of a negative budget, which is where someone, even after advice, has got less income, not enough income to meet all their essentials. And Universal credit is a massively important lifeline for our clients. About a third of our clients on UC, some in work, some not in work. But 4 in 10 of those clients of ours on UC have a negative budget after advice. So this goes very much to sort of the point you've been discussing about an essentials guarantee. And so just kind of, our experience is that sounds like a good idea. What that negative budget means is, well, we see people on negative budgets, we track people after advice. And even 15 months later, people who can't meet their essentials have lower well-being. They're more likely they have to keep borrowing for essentials. They keep falling behind on things like rent and council tax and utility bills. So that link between debt and barriers into work and staying in work and debt work progression and all the other harms that debt causes keep happening. So this idea of making sure that people can pay their essentials is absolutely essential. Now, it's, pardon the pun, it's going to take a while to work that out. So just a couple of things that kind of, what can be done immediately. So Ian, you started talking about tax credits and tax credit overpayments. We still have a problem of deductions from universal credit to recover things like tax credit overpayments, which are unaffordable. That could put £50, £60 a week into people's pockets now if we reformed that and made it more affordable. So that's something to maybe take away and see if that can push on. The other thing maybe is when we're thinking about essentials and the income side, but there's also the expense side of it. So you touched upon rent costs, and so things like rent, fuel, council tax. There are things there that can be done. Why have we got people on very low incomes paying proportions of council tax? It just made a regressive tax more regressive. Ideas about things like social tariffs for fuel, which we have in water. So there are some things that can be done, and really there it's the policy need to think right across the piece of looking at people on low incomes of how to best support them.
Yeah.
And finally, your point on universal support is a very good one. One of the things that's difficult for us advice agents is how do we keep giving those people with ongoing problems, ongoing support. Thank you.
You know, have the last word rather than the first here. So, Katie.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think the point about skills is really well made, and I think there's a job here for employers as well as for public services. We've seen levels of employer training fall to very low levels in this country, and it is a real concern. And so I think there's definitely something on that side we need to think about. But actually, on the support into employment side of things as well, within universal credit, there are some really quite unhelpful rules, I think, which limit people's ability to retrain. There have been some changes to that recently that have improved it a bit, but I think there is still much further we could go to be supporting people to actually not just move into work, but to progress once they are in work. And at the moment, a lot of the conversation is very much about sort of sanctions and conditionality in work, and I think that is just completely the wrong way of coming at the problem. If you talk to people who are in that situation of being in work and often wanting to get on in work, but there are big risks in changing jobs. People need skills and retraining sometimes to change jobs, and actually it's often issues like childcare that are preventing them from doing it. So, I think we've got sort of the right issue. It's an important issue, but coming at it in the wrong way. Just quickly on Peter's point, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There are lots of. So I think if we think of the sort of essentials guarantee idea as the goal of where we want to get to, there are lots of things we could be doing immediately that would improve the situation. The obvious one is making sure the benefits actually keep pace with rising prices, so uprating, absolutely essential. But I think the point you make about deductions actually being affordable for people is another one that is quite an easy to do, very low cost thing to do actually as well. And thinking about things like social tariffs. So I think there is a basket of things that could be done quickly. But if I could just finish really quickly on the point about costs, because it's obviously really important. But I think what we fail to grasp at the moment is the way in which the costs of people, of our sort of social security system being at a 40-year low, those costs are distributed across other parts of the system. They're being borne by charities who are feeding people, who are thinking this winter about how they're going to help people to stay warm. And they're being borne by our public services as well. The levels of hospital admissions for malnutrition have tripled in this country in a short space of time. There are different ways in which the costs flow into the system as a result of not having an adequate social security system. So I think, we need to think about that in the round, to use that phrase from Liz Truss. We also, I think, Charlotte is absolutely right. We should also be tackling the drivers of our social security bill. So that is things like not having enough social housing for people to bring down the costs for renters. It does mean supporting people to move into work and to progress in work as well. So there are lots of things we could be doing to bring that bill down, but fundamentally, the system that we have needs to be more adequate, and it needs to make sure, at the very least, in a country like ours, people can afford the essentials.
A few very quick points. So was it Gina? I think was your question about young people and skills. It amazes me, and this is a bit like my Job Centre Plus point, but it amazes me that we still think, given what we know about the current labour market, given what we know about young people today, that sending a kid into a classroom to sit in a chair with a teacher standing at the front, kind of basically dictating to them, is the best we can do with education. It's another model that we've effectively gone, yeah, we're happy with what was designed decades ago, when, you know, you basically had a career for life, essentially. You know, you do one thing. Most young people today are going to come out and need to do not just multiple jobs, but multiple careers. And for a lot of young people, particularly those that might be struggling, maybe a bit disillusioned, their parents probably had a really bad experience of school, we think that's the best thing. Go and sit still and quiet, largely. We need to rethink how we do education. So actually we're exciting young people about the opportunities, and we're equipping them with the skills to go out into a modern labour market. And we're just not doing that. And we're not even really talking about it. You know, I could throw in, we're talking about grammar schools. I mean, really? Is that really the best conversation we can have about education today? I'll stop that, because I think there's probably others on the panel that probably disagree with me on that. But I'll stop on that. On the deductions thing, so one of the things that terrifies me that is still yet to do in terms of the migration into UC is the transfer of the current tax credit cohort, and the level of debt that is going to bring across into UC is really scary. And so actually you're going to get a lot of people who are going to be hit really hard, and given where we are in the economy, the cost of living crisis, that should be something that government is really, really focused on. And there's a very final point on the expenses. Absolutely, we always focus on the income side, but actually you look at a lot of areas, not just the things we've talked about that kind of are the big sort of, you know, social housing rather than private rental, or, you know, whatever it is, but actually the poverty premiums that are built in to just lots of day-to-day consumer kind of items is horrendous. And so I think that's an area, again, that government could be doing stuff on that isn't requiring more state funding, but could make a massive impact in just enabling people's current money to go that little bit further. So I think having those conversations, maybe that links back to the point earlier about the Conservatives really thinking about what would make a difference to those who are marginalised. I think tackling those poverty premiums in the system would be, you know, a really meaningful thing to do.
Well, you've covered pretty much everything. I just want to come back to this point over here. We'll deal with the other one about the effect of lockdown. But when we were, not much of a secret, I suppose, but it was very much what happened. At the time we were struggling to try and get universal credit through, there were, you know, bodies unhappy with the process, but it was a fight, as Charlie's talked about, and obviously you have to fight for things that you believe in. But one of the areas that was the final demand was that as they come over from tax credits, then universal credit would accept the debt from the tax credit thing. Now, in the end, to get it through, we had to accept that that was a position, although I always felt that was a battle that had to be refought, because it was an absurdity. It's an absurdity because the Treasury, that is to say that part of the Treasury that has been responsible for the tax credit system, instead of it being part of the DWP, it was put inside that system because they're not audited. So we never found out how much the losses were on tax credit. Some say it's well over 20 billion that was lost through debt, through all sorts of issues that were the problem. And the trouble is, none of that money was being got back at the time. So when it's handed over to the universal credit system, which had a debt collection process in there, which was structured so that they could manage it, of course, this was never being done, and suddenly it dumps on. So there was a disincentive for people to come from tax credits into universal credit, because on tax credits, they weren't being chased where they were. But when they get to universal credit, then they would automatically go into a system of recapping on the benefits that was owed. And that, therefore, was A, a disincentive to come across, and B, also then suddenly they discovered they had a debt which they hadn't got back at the time. So that was a mistake. I always argued that, in fact, that should be left where it was. And if they want to sort that out, they can sort it out there, but not bring it across to universal credit, because it gives a bad reputation to universal credit on arrival. It's nothing to do with universal credit at all. And it makes it difficult for that group, because they start off their life then with a thundering great debt, which means retrieval means less income. And so and some of that debt, by the way, is very old indeed. And it was down to the mistakes that were made during the setup of tax credits. It had nothing to do with universal credit. So I'd certainly say, look, it's time for a moratorium. Just get rid of that stuff. And just accept you were never going to get that money back. It's just one of those things, and you're going to have to let universal credit get on with the here and now rather than the past debt. That was the case. The other point I would make is that it is, genuinely, there is reform still that will improve things and get more income. And the truth is, we should remember that we are coming out of a period, possibly the worst 3 years that I can ever recall in government, because of the pandemic, the lockdown, and the consequences, not just of locking down once, but 3 times, and nearly a 4th time, which would have been an absolute unmitigated disaster. And the people that face the disaster greatest are the people on the lowest incomes, because, of course, their flexibilities are less. And therefore, the other bit which fed in, and the CSJ has done some work on this, which is that people on low incomes face bigger cost margins than people up the income scale. For example, just getting bank statements is a really interesting point. To get a printed bank statement, you have to pay more, because they insist on doing it online. But lots of these families are either not online or very poor about sorting that out. I mean, anyone who's been online banking knows it's a complex affair at the best of times, and we all struggle with it. But if you're somebody whose educational levels and your abilities on computers is less, then immediately you're going to struggle and therefore not get information. So getting a printed bank statement is more expensive. Finding somewhere where you can get cash now, because most of your payments are going to be in cash, is difficult. Getting people to accept cash are all problems. And so these are all mounting costs, which most of us won't face, because we're capable of meeting the new ways of doing things. But the new ways of doing things don't always benefit. If you don't have some kind of ability to operate a computer, only 5% of the available jobs out there can be ever done by you. That immediately limits your choice. So getting people to understand how to operate a computer is critical for their future and ability to get jobs. So these are the areas you invest in. You will change lives. They will go back into work quicker. So investing in training and retraining is critical at the moment if you want to get back in the workforce. And we say we need to bring more people in. My argument is no. You've got a lot of people who could actually come into the workforce. So reforming and changing that so we bring more of them into the workforce is the critical reform that is required now, particularly following the pandemic, because so many have left the workforce. People with disabilities could be back very early if we were able to get that process right. And people who are trapped at the moment in debt, etc., who won't come back into work, because going back into work means you have to start repaying your debt off very fast. All these things resolved mean you have a ready-made workforce. And then if you add training to that and retraining, then all of a sudden you've got a growing economy and you've got a workforce to meet. So I would look at that as a progressive rather than anything that's retrograde.
Thank you very much. This is the first session I've run that has gone the full length. And it's gone the full length because it's been packed with expert ideas and information from all 3 people who have spoken. All I'd say in conclusion is that right at the start, both Katie and Charlotte referred to public opinion with views that leant in different directions. We all know, for all these expert ideas, there's a big fiscal consolidation coming up. Yep. So public opinion will be crucial. So I'm thanking Reform, I'm thanking the JRF, and finally, Ian, I'm thanking you. You've seen it all before, these sessions of public expenditure consolidation and trying to get the system right. All I can say is I hope they're listening to you, and good luck. Thank you very much.